Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this Wednesday, August 8th, 2018 day. I am your host for the Millennial Roundtable, Nick Pitts. I'm joined in studio live with Kerby Anderson.
Live. And again, it's good to be live with you, too.
Yeah, it is always good to share some space with you, because there is so much that we have to cover today.
Here we go again.
And so we're going to need to make our way through some stuff. And so we've got a lot. This is obviously it's an election aftermath Wednesday. So we'll be looking at some of the takeaways from the Tuesday's election that happened yesterday, everywhere from Michigan to Ohio to Missouri to Kansas to Washington. We'll be kind of giving an analysis of that, and if there's implications, if there's forecast predictions that we might be able to infer based on what happened last night to potentially what's going to happen in 3 to 4 months from now in November, when the mass of America goes to the polls in these midterm elections, not only at the state and local level, but also at the federal level with the Senate races, as well as will the House of Representatives flip. We'll be talking a little bit more about that. And then we're also going to be talking about a little bit about what's happening online. And so specifically some of the hate that's coming in, the vitriol that's going to continue to be spewed based on the New York Times latest hire, bringing on Sarah Jiang as their tech writer onto the op-ed board, and some of her problematic tweets. We'll be exploring some of that and what does that indicate about the New York Times, as well as a phenomenal David French article on Alex Jones and the censoring of the InfoWars founder from Facebook, from YouTube, and others. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that, as well as overviewing some of the other news of the day. But we have to get started with what happened last night, or rather, what continues to happen. Kerby. Continues to happen.
Yeah, is it
morning.
over yet? Is the line I usually use when we have these ongoing debates? Because again, Troy Balderson, who's the Republican, in what I guess I will mention one of the articles you posted, the ruby red Ohio, and I thought CNN maybe overdid it, but that's okay. It is definitely a seat that was held by John Kasich. It has been a Republican seat for some time. There's no reason not to believe so. It's kind of in the suburbs of Columbus. And in the next hour, we'll have our listeners from Ohio join us, and they can even tell us more about that. But he's leading, but just barely, over Danny O'Connor. And, of course, you also had a Green candidate that took away maybe 1,000 votes that might have gone to the Democrat. But the bigger issue, and if indeed I can believe the New York Times, and I guess we can, is still close to call, because you have 3,435 provisional ballots. Okay, let me explain that to anybody that doesn't know that, because I've worked in elections and I'm a precinct chairman, so I can say this with some certainty. And that is, there are individuals that will come to a particular precinct, and they will look on the voter rolls and they'll say, "You're not on the voter rolls." No, "Well, I've lived here for 20 years. You know, sometimes they haven't, but nevertheless. And so they say, "Well, we don't want to turn you away, but we also can't actually let you vote, so we'll give you a provisional ballot." The hue and cry you get sometimes, by the way, Nick, when that comes out, is just off the charts. Now, the bottom line is sometimes they're honest mistakes. An individual went to the wrong precinct. It's a provisional ballot. They should have been in that precinct, but they still voted correctly. No problem. In some cases, it's deliberately attempting to take people from Dayton or Toledo or Akron or Cleveland who come in and say, "Oh, you know," and so sorting that out is very significant. But again, if a high percentage of those provisional ballots are Democrat versus Republican and voted for O'Connor versus Balderson, then this would go the other direction. So we'll see where it plays itself out. Some of the provisional ballots are due to the fact that people have moved and they're not in that district and not eligible. So
yeah.
It's a tedious process, and most of the time never matters because most elections aren't close, but this one is.
Most elections don't have only 1,700 votes that are separating them. Right. 1,700 votes. It just is another reminder that every vote counts.
Don't you know?
But one of the interesting things that we're continuing to see is that President Trump came in and was very loud in vocal support. And so I believe it was 14 races now that he has endorsed an individual, 14 races he's endorsed an individual, and that person has gone over the hump and ended up winning, which is just very fascinating.
Well, and let me read from a Donald Trump tweet. He made it about himself, which I know surprises you.
In a shocking twist.
Yeah, in a shocking twist. He said, when I decided to go to Ohio for Troy Balderson, he was down in early voting 64-36. That was not good. But after my speech on Saturday night, there was a big turn for the better. Now Troy wins a great victory during a very tough time of the year for voting. He will win big in November. So it was more about Donald Trump, but nevertheless, whether it's Donald Trump coming and having a rally for him, whether it's some of the talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh and others talking about the race, and on the other side, also CNN, MSNBC, and of course the mainstream media, NBC, CBS, and ABC, all kind of focused on the Ohio race. You would think the only special election was yesterday. You mentioned, of course, Kansas and Washington and a number of other places, but nevertheless, that was the one that the mainstream media focused on, and that's the place where a lot of money was put in. And as far as I can determine, the turnout for Democrats was higher than normal, and the turnout for Republicans lower than normal, which probably won't be the case in the midterms. But nevertheless, that's another argument for here comes that blue wave.
Oh, yeah. So will it be a blue wave or red wave? One of the interesting things, Kirby, when you look back on this particular district, so this the Ohio, what's the Ohio 12th? We got the Ohio 12th district. President Trump in 2016 secured, I think, 53% of the vote, won by 11 points. Mitt Romney in 2012, 54%. But again, those aren't midterms. Obviously, those are presidential elections, so naturally there's going to be a larger amount of turnout. But what's fascinating is what many Democrats are taking heart in right now is that they were able to shore up that chasm that had been created, which is causing some to say, well, this is just another indicator of the blue wave, but then others to say, well, moral victories don't actually make electoral victories, right? And so it'll be very interesting to see what's going to happen come 2018.
Well, another thing I would add to it, again, you've posted our first article here, takeaways from the Tuesday election. We'll probably talk more about it in the next hour, but one of those is the progressive push hit a snag in the Midwest, and that is you've got two things, Nick, happening simultaneously. You have some Democrats that are running like Republicans, and we've seen that in Alabama. I would have to say that's probably true of Danny O'Connor in this particular case, the 12th Congressional District. Just a few miles from here, one of the people I've had sit in this chair actually was telling me that she has run in this particular district, and her opponent in the push cards doesn't even mention that he's a Democrat.
Wow.
Okay, so there are some that are just so far running away from the label, and you read down there and you're going, I think Donald Trump could agree with almost everything except the one about universal health care, but everything else looks, very red, not blue. Then on the other hand, that's the other part of this. There are others that are saying, no, we need to double down. And that's, of course, Bernie Sanders, and that's Alexia Ocasio-Cortez and others. It's Elizabeth Warren, some of the statements she made even this week, which we talked about yesterday with Star Parker about, the racist criminal justice system. And so it'll be interesting to see which way and which path the Democrats go and which one works for trying to bring about a blue wave.
Yeah, and so there are many implications. So which way is are Democrats going to go? But specifically, even maybe more interesting for our listeners, does having the Trump bump, drawing yourself closer to President Trump, does that cause you to have a bump? Is that going to be seen as advantageous come the midterms? And so we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we're going to continue to break down what happened specifically in Ohio to Michigan and then a couple of other states. And so we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Even though there's lots of evidence that violence is declining, many people don't believe it. On my radio program, we have documented that the violent crime rate has dropped significantly over the last few decades. And if you want a longer look at the decline in violence over millennia, you can pick up the 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. Apparently, many people don't believe it. That is why he spends a few pages in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, trying to answer some of the skeptical comments and questions. Here are a few of his responses. Some wonder how you can say violence has decreased when we hear about school shootings and terrorist bombings. He points out that decline is not the same thing as disappearance. Something can decrease quite a bit without vanishing altogether. The best way to examine the level of violence is to look at the level today and compare it to the level in the past. Others argue that all of these statistics mean nothing if you are one of the victims. That is certainly true, but it also means that you are less likely to be a victim. All of the stories about civil wars, terrorist attacks, and other examples of violence make us feel like the world is more dangerous than it was in the past. He has even heard people charge him with being naive, sentimental, idealistic, and romantic because he says violence has gone down. He merely says, look at the data. To look at the data and say that violence has gone up is delusional. To ignore the data and say that violence has gone up is to be a know-nothing. This discussion about violence is yet another reminder that there is often a major difference between perception and reality. That is why we need to do good research and exercise discernment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, joined in studio by Kerby Anderson, and we have been talking about the the special election that happened yesterday. We've got the polls are still going on. The polls aren't open, obviously, anymore, but we do have, out of the Ohio 12th, a very close race, just a small little margin of 1,700 votes that's separating who appears to be the winner, Troy Balderson, from the Democrat, Danny O'Connor, with 99,000 votes. It's another reminder of just how important your vote is and how significant. I mean, we can talk about it from a biblical perspective of just the idea that voting is one of the ways that you have the opportunity to be able to love your neighbor, to raise your voice for those that are voiceless, to really put your values on the ballot box. It's just another way for you to be able to love your neighbor. But it also is very interesting, Kerby, as we're looking at this special election, there's a couple of things that come to mind. And let's just look at it from the political perspective right now, which is just very interesting, because there are some that are saying that this special election, the 12th, is just indicative of the blue wave that's coming come November. Or there are others that are arguing that this is a special election is that. It's very special. It's unique. You can't project what's going to happen 3-4 months from now from what's happening right now. So what do we think of it?
Well, again, and I'm going to really try to be fair on this, because on the one hand, you do get a little bit of an insight into elections with special elections. And that is one of the reasons why, as you look at this piece that you've posted here, whether it's the House or the Senate, you look at some special elections. Let me pick Alabama in a Senate race, and let me pick Ohio in a House race. And so it suggests the possibility of a blue wave. But in order for that to work, the best scenario, if I were a political scientist, would be one where the participation rate was similar in a special election to a midterm. there's no evidence that that's the case. There seems to be some evidence. I've heard this. I didn't check it because I was so busy writing a booklet this morning, but I've heard that there was a much higher percentage of Democrats showing up, especially in Franklin County, which is the one that O'Connor won, compared to the rest. So it's a little different. So you don't want to extrapolate too much. But again, our friends at CNN said it's time for Republicans to panic about the House. And even the other day when we had some of our experts here, I'll just pick Kelly Shackelford as one that's talked about the fact that he thinks, and I've heard some other people say it could be 50-50 as to whether or not the Democrats take the House of Representatives. Quite possible, because you only need about 24. And can I identify some districts where Republicans are hurting and where Democrats have outraised them? Yes, I can.
Yeah, I mean, we're living in one right now. Case. We've got Dallas listeners right now that are keenly aware. I mean, I can't drive anywhere in Dallas. It's very rare do I see a Pete Sessions sign.
That's right.
But Colin Allred, I see his signs everywhere right now. Or here in Texas. You
and
see
people are starting to write that one off. You know, some of the RNC might actually write off Pete Sessions, isn't he, number 3 or something like that in the Republican leadership. Of course, we saw what happened to number 3 in the Democratic leadership in the Bronx. So this may be a little bit of throw the rascals out kind of phenomenon happening both sides of that. So one argument could be that you have at least a 50-50 chance, and I'll go with that right now, that the House could be taken over by the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi would be Speaker of the House. When you come to the Senate, that's more difficult. I will concede Tennessee, since you're from Tennessee, and we've watched that. I think he's up 3 to 5 points, but, the ex-governor probably going to win that one. What happens on the other hand? Do you flip the other way? Missouri, North Dakota, Montana, West Virginia, wherever it is. And so maybe those even out. I give it less of a chance there, but it could be you end up with a split between a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. The worst case scenario, obviously, for the Republicans is a Democratic House and Senate. And the best case scenario is somehow, and this one would take some work and some change rather dramatically, for the Republicans to retain control of the House and also have the Senate. So I don't know right now, but I would say that anybody looking at that would say there is a blue wave, but it's not going to be a tsunami, but it's going to be a wave large enough possibly for the Democrats to take over the House.
What I think is going to be really interesting, especially from the Democratic side, is to the extent that they understand or to the extent that they're going to run with this whole socialist platform.
There you go.
Democratic socialism.
That's my disclaimer.
We're starting to see it in New York. Obviously, Elizabeth Warren has been a pretty big proponent. Obviously, the chief proponent is Bernie Sanders. But then we hear about these O'Connors that are running in Ohio, and a socialism platform, a tenet of the platform, is not going to go as well. And to a certain degree, we saw O'Connor wasn't as adamant and wasn't antagonistic towards President Trump. So there's sides of the argument that are trying to make much of this socialist platform. And I think this is the reason why people are listening to Point of View. It's a little bit more of a nuanced perspective on some of these things. But it appears as though there are certain Democrats that are achieving electoral success that are, one, not being as vocal and antagonistic towards President Trump, and two, understand the error in their thinking of trying to advocate for socialist policies here in the U.S.
And I think that's partially back to the thing that you and I've talked about before. People are watching the extremes arguing with each other, and there used to be, and there still is some places in the country, a place where you have conservative Democrats. I mean, last week on Wednesday, I had one woman call in and say, I can't believe you're saying all the Democrats are socialists. No, that's not the point. What we're saying is some of Democrats are socialists. Not all Democrats are. Some Democrats are running as far away from it as possible, and you're going to get this kind of split strategy. But the reality is, where's the money? The Tom Steyers and a variety of other people that we can mention that are really big donors, George Soros is certainly in that, are tending to give more money to the more strident, progressive activist types. And if you are going to run, as we saw in Alabama, or let's just say, I don't know enough about Danny O'Connor, but it looks like he ran the same way of, hey, I'm just kind of a middle-of-the-road kind of Democrat, vote for me. And I'm not, I don't like Donald Trump, but I also won't vote like Donald Trump, and I will be an independent voice. Well, that might work for some of those individuals, especially when they're in the so-called red states.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting as you continue to break it down, because then it offers up to the other side of the argument, the other side of the aisle, rather. You're going to have Republicans that are largely trying to figure out how closely am I going to align with President Trump? Because for better or for worse, he's done quite a bit. His administration has accomplished, policy-wise, pretty significant achievements when it comes to a conservative's agenda. But then you see him that he's picking fights with everyone from LeBron James to the Koch brothers.
Why he did that in Ohio of all places
and so
is beyond me.
So you see him picking fights with LeBron James in Ohio when they had the special election in Ohio, and then the Koch brothers picking fights with them.
Yeah.
So it's just it really does raise that question, because then I think about Tennessee, for example, just because they just had their primary election rather, and Diane Black tried to run as closely as she could in the governor's race towards President Trump, and then she came in third place in that primary. So it does make me question, Kirby, if there's going to be individuals that are trying to figure out what is that middle position with the Republicans that I want to associate with President Trump. I want to support the policies, but the person I might want to create some distance from.
Well, and again, one of the most popular movies right now is Mission Impossible. What's the theme there? I disavow any knowledge of you. And if you had asked me, Nick, back in January, I think it is. Matter of fact, we did talk about this back in January and February. How close will any of these candidates run next to Donald Trump? I was expecting to hear a lot of, I have no knowledge of the president, nor do I plan to support him. And then on numerous occasions now, Donald Trump comes in, and again, Donald Trump says, and if he says it, it must be true, that, Troy Balderson was down 64-36 in early voting. I come in and turn it around. And of course, if he ends up winning, that's going to be another notch in the belt, and another reason why there are going to be some candidates, especially in places where Donald Trump did relatively well or where the economy is booming, to say, yeah, come on in and do a rally for me. Other places, if you're running in a blue state and the economy isn't done as well there, or there's just a lot of anti-Trump animus for whatever reason, you just kind of keep your distance. And I think we'll see both.
So for our Texas listeners, I just saw reports out that, or at least the reports by the Hill that are indicating that Ted Cruz has asked President Trump to come in and to help.
Isn't that amazing?
Because again,
I wouldn't think he needs the help, but he does.
His race has just gotten so close.
I always say Cruz will lose, and I just love to watch people's reaction when I say Cruz will lose, including one of our co-hosts here,
and so
who just almost stopped when I said that.
Because it's really interesting right now to see what's happening relative to the polarizing effect that President Trump has on individuals. And I think it points to something that I think many Americans are saying, and I mentioned this today in the daily briefing, that 78% of Americans are angry at the government right now. Not dissatisfied with them, not unfavorably viewed towards them, angry at them. And I think a large part of that anger is due to the fact that it just seems like it's, one, so polarizing, and two, just so ineffective. We're just not doing anything, which is, there's a lot of talk back and forth. It's like a soap opera, but in reality, they need to be a government, and they need to be deregulating. They need to be passing bills in order to be able to make sure that passing spending bills to make sure that this government thing doesn't shut down.
And you have a split government right now. It'll be worse. You've got a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. Nothing will get done. I will predict that with certainty.
It will be interesting to say the very least. But we've got to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we'll continue talking a little bit more about the elections, but also give an analysis of the latest hire by the New York Times and how that reveals a little bit more about the spirit of the times. So we'll be back right after this.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for $1? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear Point of View not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year, and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined by Kerby Anderson in studio, and we've been talking about some of the takeaways from Ohio's special election to Michigan, et cetera, and talking about the presidential Trump bump, I guess you could say. How individuals are experiencing a little bit of a bump when he comes in, but then there are other individuals that are trying to navigate through. And since we're primarily based here in Dallas, obviously there's some of you that are watching online right now, and we're so grateful that you're watching online. You can leave a comment or question on Facebook.com/PointOfViewRadio. Any comment or question that you have, you can chime in. But Kerby and I, let's talk shop right now. And so let's get specifically local relative to here in Dallas. We're in Pete Sessions' district right now.
Good point.
Pete Sessions is in the fight for his life right now because in a shocking twist, you've just got an individual, a Democrat, that is within striking distance, almost within the margin of error right now. Latest poll I saw was 5 points that Pete was up right now. You get the Cook Political Report that says that's moved it to a lean now, Republican.
To a toss-up.
To a toss-up.
That's
now.
what I've seen.
And so it really is a very close race. So that raises the philosophical question that I'm always prone to ask because I'm an inquisitive millennial that questions everything. Why? Why is it in 2018 that this Pete Sessions, the 32nd district, is so close right now? Is it less about Pete Sessions, or is it more just about the blue wave? Why is it so close?
There's all sorts of ways to answer that, but I'll try to answer it one geographically. Let's look at that, and then we'll look at some others. Geographically, I've got the actual district up there. I guess I could hold it up for the screen if people haven't seen it.
Screens on screens.
The bottom line is this. There used to be just 30 congressional districts, so when they expanded it to 32 because our population increased, that created a situations in which sitting Congressman Pete Sessions had to defend some territory that wasn't necessarily favorable towards Republican values. Now, if you look at the actual district, he's got Highland Park, University Park, Preston Hollow. Anybody in the Dallas area knows that's going to be about as red as you can possibly be. As you get into Richardson, that's fine. But from there on, it's Garland, Rowlett, Saxe, Wiley, and it starts moving into what before was pretty much of a Democratic district. I'm old enough to remember when Jim Maddox, who was a member of Congress at one point, actually had that district, and that was really a Democratic district. And so when you started dividing up and moving and gerrymandering some of this, which in some respects helped people like Sam Johnson and will help Van Taylor, who sat in this chair a couple of times now, it hurts Pete Sessions. So geographically, first of all, he's not necessarily defending the same district he was defending. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, as you have pointed out, when we look at this district, Hillary Clinton won it. And so there are all sorts of reasons for that as well. One other one I'll add, and I'll see what you have, because you probably have some ideas as well. I think there is a little bit of an anti-incumbent kind of mindset, and it shows up in two ways. First of all, Republicans that would be more predisposed to vote for him aren't that excited about him because he wasn't seen as kind of one of their guys, and on a lot of issues voted in ways they maybe didn't feel so comfortable. So he didn't get as much Republican support. And on the other hand, you had some other individuals that have been kind of dedicated to trying to switch this district for some time. So all of that comes together, whether it's geography, apathy, as well as just the anti-incumbent fervor. I think he's got a race that he's never had before.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some wisdom in that. I think one of the things that I would be a little bit more to discount, which I agree, like we don't want to draw districts. I know there's the gerrymandering component where you don't want to draw districts that are just all red and all blue, because at the end of the day, then you just create purity tests. And then with purity tests, you never get anyone to be able to compromise. And nothing ever gets done because everyone's always afraid of being called a rhino.
That's
or
right.
not really a liberal or whatever. And so I think that there's that component. I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing here in this district in particular is that there's just such a massive influx of individuals that are moving in right now.
Yeah, that's another very good issue.
There are 400 people every day that are moving into the DFW right now, and many of them are either, one, not familiar with Pete Sessions, Two, they're familiar with President Trump and they're unfavorable towards him, or maybe some are favorable towards him. I don't want to just say everybody that's moving in is anti-Trump, but I do think you're starting to see just this sense of this isn't the same Texas that we grew up with, or that individuals grew up with. That this is very beginning to look a little different of Texas, and so there's that part of it that it could be interesting. I think one of the key points, though, that will come down into the November election is how many people actually show up.
There's the point.
I think that's going to be there's especially from the millennial standpoint, it's one thing to be able to post a favorable status of an individual. It's quite another thing to take time out of your schedule during early elections or on election day and actually cast your ballot, which we've seen with millennials in particular is just not happening right now.
Well, and again, millennials are one part of it, but just the population in general for just a minute has to do with the fact that who is most motivated to show up. And in the 2010 election, which really seemed to favor the Republicans nationwide, and then add 4 more years to 2014, we saw that as well. And of course, you had things like the Tea Party. This is, again, where I'll try to be fair. You can argue for a blue wave in the sense that you'd say that the Democrats are motivated. Mm-hmm. And I can identify when we look at these 32 districts in the state of Texas, we'll just stay in Texas for a moment, you have at least 6 or more, and that's at least ones that I know of, where the Democrat has outraised the Republican. Mm-hmm. So that shows some enthusiasm financially. Does that enthusiasm show up in terms of walking precincts, putting up signs? Probably does as well. So this one could come back in the other direction because the motivated group right now are the Democrats. The less motivated are the Republicans. Now, is there any way that reverses? Well, the closer you get to an election, more people start paying attention to it. And I do want to suggest that the possibility that the Kavanaugh nomination might generate some. Yeah. It might not. But if all of a sudden people are just saying Brett Kavanaugh is just getting beat up by all these Democratic senators, and if we don't pay attention right now, we're going to lose the opportunity to put more of these people on the Supreme Court and on the federal bench, maybe they show up. But right now, I think the odds-on favorite are Democrats have the motivation and they have the momentum. We'll see where it plays it out.
It will be interesting because, like you said, there's the presupposition that individuals are paying attention right now, which I think the vast majority of Americans have started to tune out. Yeah. I think that's clear from the research that if they were paying attention, they're frustrated and then they're no longer paying attention to that. And so I think the second part that I think is going to be really interesting is, yes, there's the Kavanaugh nomination, which, again, could go either way. You could what we saw with President Trump, that there was individuals that highly value a pro-life position and highly value the Supreme Court, and they're willing to go to great lengths in order to support that position, moving that forward. Even if they were disfavorable towards President Trump, they so wanted to have someone that was going to appoint individuals towards that cause that they voted in that area. What I think is going to be equally important or equally interesting, I'll say, is what effect these tariffs have on some of these just some of these bread and butter issues. So I think about Tennessee, for example, as well as Michigan right now. Michigan will be a pretty close race. There's there's an individual, John, I think James John is his name. Johnson is his name. I'm going to have to look that up. That is running right now out of Michigan for Debbie Stabenow's seat. And he is a compelling guy. John James, rather, is his name. He's a compelling guy, and just you can watch him, and you'll just be swept away. He's just very, very good on the campaign trail. But what will be interesting, though, is do these tariffs have effects, especially in a place like Detroit or some of these other places that are much more blue collar in nature? I think about Tennessee, for example, with the tariffs and soybeans right now, and tariffs here in Texas as well when it comes to cotton, et cetera, et cetera. What are the effects? Because those things hit people immediately when it comes to the food, when it comes to jobs, et cetera, et cetera.
So again, this will be very self-promoting, but that's okay. My commentary yesterday is on tariffs in Congress, in which I argue that maybe some of the economic fallout will not hit in November, but if it does, one of the things we've seen in the Rasmussen polls are Trump supporters are willing to hang with him a little bit longer because they know that the goal is not tariffs. The goal is to use tariffs to get rid of tariffs. So they may hang on a little bit longer. But what about the again, like we like to talk about, the low information voter who's simply saying, this is really hurting my economy, and I don't think the president knows what he's doing. That will affect them. And a lot of elections, as we all know, are local. In some cases, we just talked about a congressional election. Maybe when we come back, we can talk about a senatorial election, because how in the world would Ted Cruz, who was running as the president just a few years ago, in the race for his life? And when you drive up and down the Dallas area, you see all sorts of Beto signs, Beto signs, whatever you want to pronounce his name. And to find a Ted Cruz sign, that's like trying to find a unicorn.
I have yet to see one Ted Cruz. I've seen Ted Cruz logos on cars every now and then, but oh my gosh. But like Kerby said, we've got to take a break. But when we come back from the break, we're going to switch over from the House side to the Senate side, specifically Ted Cruz and Beto's race. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. You probably know the story of Aaron and Melissa Klein, the bakers in Oregon forced out of business and fined $135,000 by the state when they politely declined business that would have forced them to violate their religious convictions. What you may not know is that after the state of Oregon pronounced them guilty of discrimination, private citizens were eager to show their contempt for the Kleins. Many of the comments they received are so vulgar that I cannot repeat them here, but here is a tame sampling. One person writing on Facebook said to the Kleins, "I hope your shop burns." Another chimed in, noting that she hoped Aaron and Melissa would burn in hell. One man sent a message that said, "I hope you lose your house and have to live on the streets." One woman even said, "We hope your children get cancer and die." When the government declares that citizens like Aaron and Melissa are not entitled to the Constitution's promises of religious liberty and free speech, its people push aside any goodwill that allows people to coexist peacefully with beliefs with which they may disagree. Aaron and Melissa have asked the Oregon Supreme Court to review their case. We hope the court will accept the appeal, if only to remind everyone that it is possible to live peacefully as neighbors, even when we disagree. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, and welcome to Point of View, and welcome back from Point of View. Welcome back to Point of View. Third time's a charm. There we go.
Yeah, it's okay.
Welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts. I'm joined by Kerby Anderson, and we have been talking about elections, election politics, everything that happened last night in Ohio, specifically about the close race between O'Connor and Balderson, and Balderson appears to have pulled it out, even though there's provisional ballots. And then how it's trickled out to now trying to figure out what's going to happen in November come Texas, since this is primarily a Texas audience right now that's listening right now. We've got some listeners also in Minnesota, and then obviously all around the world when it comes to the Facebooks and the YouTubes, one might say. But we're going to focus a little bit more. We're going to switch from this 32nd congressional district with Pete Sessions and Colin Allred to then start transitioning and talking a little bit more about the race that really is just captivating the nation's attention right now. And I don't mean that to sound audacious, because, as you know, Texans tend to think about Texas quite a bit. But nevertheless, it is a very interesting race when it comes to Ted Cruz, who just 2 years ago was a contender to win the presidency of the United States. Now is in the race for his life to be able to save his Senate seat right now against, I believe, a 3-term congressman in Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah, well, again, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, we talked about those signs. Let's talk about that for just a minute. I got to give Beto some credit, because one of the things he did for a while was charge people for the signs.
Oh, wow.
So that means, first of all, when you see a sign, it might mean that they're also a donor. So that level of involvement is something you don't see very often. Mm-hmm. But that is certainly the case on the one side. Now, on the other side, let me just represent, because I was at a Republican meeting recently where they were all complaining. There's all these Beto signs. There's none of these Cruz signs, right? You say you haven't seen any, and that, seeing one of those like seeing a unicorn. Well, it's because the Cruz campaign really hadn't produced a great deal, and they needed the funds to do that, and they were wanting to spend money elsewhere. So the local county Republican groups got together and they put the money forward to buy the signs and then put the signs in their headquarters and then have people come and pick them up. So that is a little bit of a surprise there as well. And part of it was because in almost every quarter, Beto, or Mr. Rourke, or whatever you want to call him, has outraised Ted Cruz. And that is what has caused everybody so much of a surprise. And, of course, you do have money from George Soros and Tom Steyer and some of those. But he's also picked up a lot of $25 donations, because those people will spend $25 to get one of those signs that they're putting in their yard. So just in terms of the visual at the moment, he, that is the Democratic challenger, has a lot more going for him than the Republican incumbent.
So here's the thing. I'll push back against you a little bit, Kerby, because, again, this just seems very difficult for me to comprehend. Because if you remember, right as soon as Beto ended up winning the primary here, or it might have been, it was the day after a special election, Ted Cruz came out with that ad. If you want to play in Texas, you gotta be a Texan or something. He had that remake, that cover song, and so it seemed as like his campaign was sharp in that moment, because literally the next morning, it was a March morning.
They were ready.
They were ready. They were rolling out. But now to not have signs, that's like one of the most fundamental, basic components of winning a that just seems so outlandish that they don't have signs of all things. They can make a clever jingle, which again galvanize the national audience, because even Morning Joe, I specifically remember, because at Dallas Baptist University we had Russell Moore that was speaking on campus that day, and it was a March morning, and it just some election had just come over, and then all of a sudden he's got because it was the primary. He released that ad. So they don't have signs, but they can come up with a jingle. That just seems so shocking to me.
I think they were squirreling some of the money away for two things. Number one, the national ads and some of the billboards and things like that, and maybe not thinking so much about the ground game, not thinking that they needed that. There's also the distraction factor. I went to the Texas Republican Convention, and I would have to say some of the best speeches were people like John Cornyn and, without a doubt, Governor Abbott, and they had their talking points down. To be nice, Ted Cruz got up there and spent as much time talking about the fact that he was going to play basketball 1-on-1 with Jimmy Kimmel than he did about his campaign. And so the illustration I've used before, maybe it was a bad illustration, but you remember Rocky, and you got Apollo Creed who's not taking it seriously, and Rocky is training. I said, he better not make sure that he's playing Apollo Creed where he's just saying, I got this one in the bag, and all of a sudden to get himself knocked down. And that certainly could be part of the issue. Now, again, the ace in the hole for Ted Cruz is they're going to do 3 debates on very important issues, Dallas, San Antonio, and other places. And again, at that point, I think he'll be able to help people understand, and even some of the campaign ads coming out saying, well, if you like Bernie Sanders, you're going to love Congressman O'Rourke, because after all, he really, on these issues, is almost a clone of him. And I think when the American people see that, and when certainly the Texas voters see that, they're going to go, okay, I think this was going to be in the bag. But up until now, it's been a lot closer than I think Ted Cruz or any of his campaign would expect.
So I think that's really interesting. So my papa would say Ted Cruz got a little too big for his britches, right? And so you've got the jingle thing that comes out, and I think that's one of the interesting things. If he's waiting off to hold national media, but at the end of the day, he's not elected he's a U.S. senator, right?
Right.
But he's a U.S. senator from Texas. He's representing Texans and the constituents in Texas, representing their interests. And so I'm glad that you have a national platform. But at the end of the day, the reason why you have a national platform is because Texas has put you into office. And so I think another thing that I think is going to be really interesting is that Beto O'Rourke has gone out to every single county here in Texas.
And he will do any interview. He will do interviews on his cell phone and everything. I mean, he has made himself so available.
He is there.
Something for Ted Cruz to think about.
So when he came out with it, and again, I disagree with Beto to a large degree, as our listeners can probably pick up on. But when he released his first campaign ad just 2 weeks ago, I told my friends, I was like, I got the chills, because that is such a good ad. The ad shows him going to every one of the 254 counties here in Texas, from little church gyms to community centers to just being outside at all of these events, that he's just going and pounding the pavement and pressing the flesh in order to be able to show that he's not a U.S. guy, he's a Texas guy that's going to represent them. Now, granted, you might have different views, as many of us will probably do, relative to what we want him to advocate for as Texans. But I think one of the fascinating things is he's recognizing that Tip O'Neill line, that all politics is local, and he's showing up. I'm captivated by the way that he's running a campaign, that even if you disagree with him, you still walk away liking him, which I think is a really big differentiating factor between him and Ted Cruz.
Well, and again, for a man that has as much money as he does, because he's raised it, you would think he'd have a lot more ads. But again, he still recognizes, as you said, politics is local, so it's grassroots. It's lots of signs, it's lots of interviews, it's pressing the flesh and being real. And again, if you want to attract what we've been talking about, the millennial voter, they're going to be saying, I'm going to just listen to him a little bit more and see what he has to say about some of that. And he's hitting some of the themes, which, again, are a little bit more on the radical side of the themes. He's not necessarily racing to the middle in all the issues he's addressing, but people find him articulate, good-looking, charismatic, able to put sentences together, make his case. And then, on the other hand, he's pretty good with the negative ads. Have you seen those billboards?
Yeah.
There's one billboard that they have up there says, I never really liked Ted Cruz, and it's George W. Bush the billboards. You know, when you're using a former Republican president, former Republican governor to trash Ted Cruz, you know, those billboards are going to show up a lot more in the next couple of weeks. I guarantee it.
Rough. And so we're going to, the billboards will appear, but we're going to have to take a break. And so when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about the takeaways, specifically here in Texas, as well as the national election, the kind of local elections around the country, and whether that will be indicative of what's going to happen, the impending blue wave, the red wave, et cetera, as well as some of this stuff from the New York Times and InfoWars. But we'll be back right after this.
Imagine a police officer telling you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151. or visit pointofview.net, because a dollar really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Fitz.
And welcome to Point of View on this Wednesday, August 8th, 2018 day. We are in the second hour, and I am joined in studio by Kerby Anderson. And we have been talking about the special elections and some of the primary elections that happened last night. Or rather, Kerby, are still ongoing this morning.
There you go.
The votes are still being counted, and so there were elections. There was a special election for the Ohio 12th, the congressional seat, as well as primary elections that were happening everywhere from Michigan to Washington last night. And there were some very close races. A lot of attention, obviously, is being given to the Ohio 12th, which there are still around 3,300 provisional ballots that are still yet to be counted. But the difference between the two, between Balderson, who's the Republican, and O'Connor, who's the Democrat, Balderson appears to be winning, appears to have won. He came out and announced victory last night, up by about 1,700 votes right now, but still around 3,300 provisional ballots. And so still yet to be official. But Kerby, last night there was just so many. I mean, we can even a lot of attention is being given to this Ohio race.
Right. But
Chris Kobach, who was running in the Republican primary for governor of Kansas, his election. I'm looking at it right now, and it's less than 200 votes that separate him from the current lieutenant governor right now of Jeff Collier.
Yeah, again, some of these are just so close. And first Ohio, and then I'll talk Kansas. Ohio, because you have those provisional ballots, and again, if people are not familiar with that, it might be somebody that comes into a precinct in the 12th Congressional District, and maybe they were in Franklin County, but they're voting in Delaware County or whatever it might be. Then they say, well, we don't have voter registration for you here, but we can give you a provisional ballot. So in some cases, those provisional ballots will be counted. In many cases, they'll be thrown out because the person came from Akron or they came from Cleveland or Toledo or something like that, and they can't vote legally in that election. But it could change some things. So that's the first one. And again, provisional ballots, Nick, are hardly ever an issue because most elections aren't close. But we have had, as a matter of fact, some of the closest elections in American history have happened in the state of Ohio.
Wow.
One of my favorite ones was, if you don't mind me digressing for just a second, was a city council election in which it was an absolute tie between these two individuals. And then the rest of the story was the individual, the man who lost, his son lives with him, and his other son lives across the street, and neither of them voted in the election. Oh. Don't you know that would have been a difficult Thanksgiving dinner? So but again, some of the closest elections have happened in places like Illinois and Ohio, and again, we have close in Ohio. But now Kansas, who would have guessed? We've known Chris Kobach. We've interviewed him before. As a matter of fact, we were in Kansas a number of years ago and had him talk to our audience that was there when we did kind of a live broadcast. And this one is so close that it obviously will be a recount. There's just no way that you can't have a recount.
Yeah, you've literally there is less than 200 votes that separate the current Lieutenant Governor Jeff Collier from Chris Kobach right now, and there's probably just rough estimate at least 300,000 votes, and so to have 300,000 votes in the Republican primary and only separated by 200 votes, we learned one thing, that every vote counts, obviously. So if you're just thinking about voting or you post that in support of a candidate, that means nothing, despite what the Russian propaganda wants to tell you. You posting does not mean that you've actually voted, so it's important for you to vote.
Let's hope nobody that's listening to this believes that.
But two, I think it's going to be really interesting to try to figure out Is there an impending blue wave? Are we beginning to see potentially with President Trump? Chris Kobach was down in the polls for all beforehand, and then President Trump came out and voiced his support in a tweet over the weekend, and lo and behold, now Chris Kobach it appears to be the winner. Are we seeing the blue wave, the red wave? What?
Yeah, it really depends on where you are. First of all, Donald Trump did tweet that indeed Troy Balderson in Ohio was down in early voting 64-36. But then I came in on Saturday night and a big turn for the better. So, and I am surprised that he made it all about him. That just never happens. But, same thing with Chris Kobach. And I think the bottom line, and Nick, I want to get your comments about this too, because it does seem to me that in some places that are red states, Ohio is a purple state, but that particular congressional district was pretty red. Matter of fact, CNN in the article you posted here called it ruby red. So, okay, I think it's probably pretty red. And Kansas, pretty red. So in those cases, and if economy is going pretty well, Donald Trump's endorsement might help. I guarantee you that in some places where Republicans are running in blue states or where it's a purple district, they probably would like to disavow any knowledge of the president if indeed he's unpopular in that particular part of the country. So it really just kind of depends.
So we're going to open it up to our listeners because we know that we have listeners that are in Ohio right now as well as listeners that are in Kansas right now. We'd be really interested to hear from you or just anyone in particular what you think, what you take from last night's elections and then predictions for 2018 midterms. Do you think that there's going to be a blue wave? Do you think there's going to be a red wave? Or are you just going to continue to wave to strangers because you're a Christian and you should show hospitality? No, but in all seriousness, we are interested in what you have to say because, Kirby, I do have my initial gut feeling right now. I know that both sides have the way that they're going to spin this. One side's going to say that a special election is just that. It's a special election, that you cannot project what happens during the special election onto the entirety. And then another side is going to say that this is just a sign of distrust. This is a sign of unfavorability among the president. And so I completely forgot to actually give the phone number to call in. 800-351-1212. Again, I knew I was forgetting something. 800-351-1212. Tell us your predictions. Do you think it's going to be a blue wave, a red wave? We'd love to hear from you. So I know the spin that's going to happen on both sides, but it seems that it's with not anything against what the president has done. His policies that have been implemented, the deregulation that's happened, the foreign policy initiatives and overtures that the president has accomplished, his policies speak for themselves from a conservative perspective. You might have some qualms about the tariffs, but that's a whole different scenario. It seems as though his unfavorabilities and the momentum on the Democrat side is just hard not to acknowledge and not to think that that's not going to continue come November 2018 when national organizations can't pour that much money into all of those congressional districts to help all of those candidates.
Well, and again, I think what you would have to say from this, and I know we're coming to a break, is this a preview of coming attractions? If the turnout in the 12th congressional district, we'll just stay in Ohio for a minute, is typical, then it is bad news for the Republican Party because you had a much higher turnout for Democrats than normal and a much lower turnout for Republicans than normal. Special election, maybe the momentum is coming that direction. So that's one possibility. And it's a reasonable one because, after all, a lot of momentum does seem to be on the Democratic side. So you could have a blue wave. I don't think you're going to have a blue tsunami, but you could certainly have a blue wave. And realistically, you only have to win about 24 of these congressional districts, and Democrats take over, and Nancy Pelosi is indeed the Speaker of the House. On the other hand, of course, you have to recognize that for people that like Donald Trump, he's got the highest approval rating ever in the Republican Party. Yeah. So for people that like him, it really works. For people that don't like him, maybe it doesn't. And in the case, again, I'll use Ohio, Danny O'Connor, who is a Democrat, he really never bashed Trump. He never really criticized Trump. He just sort of stayed under the radar. I don't think the Democrats are going to keep that campaign strategy in the fall. So we'll see how that works out, too.
So we'd love to hear from you. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or you can jump over on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. The live video feed you see there, you can go right underneath in the comment box, issue your comment or your question, and what you share online, we'll share over the air. But we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Even though there's lots of evidence that violence is declining, many people don't believe it. On my radio program, we have documented that the violent crime rate has dropped significantly over the last few decades. And if you want a longer look at the decline in violence over millennia, you can pick up the 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. Apparently, many people don't believe it. That is why he spends a few pages in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, trying to answer some of the skeptical comments and questions. Here are a few of his responses. Some wonder how you can say violence has decreased when we hear about school shootings and terrorist bombings. He points out that decline is not the same thing as disappearance. Something can decrease quite a bit without vanishing altogether. The best way to examine the level of violence is to look at the level today and compare it to the level in the past. Others argue that all of these statistics mean nothing if you are one of the victims. That is certainly true, but it also means that you are less likely to be a victim. All of the stories about civil wars, terrorist attacks, and other examples of violence make us feel like the world is more dangerous than it was in the past. He has even heard people charge him with being naive, sentimental, idealistic, and romantic because he says violence has gone down. He merely says, look at the data. To look at the data and say that violence has gone up is delusional. To ignore the data and say that violence has gone up is to be a know-nothing. This discussion about violence is yet another reminder that there is often a major difference between perception and reality. That is why we need to do good research and exercise discernment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined in studio with Kerby Anderson, and we have been talking about the election that happened last night in the special election with Ohio, the 12th Congressional District. Individuals, that really is the one that many people are talking about. Then there's obviously some of the primaries that are going around. And Kerby, what we're continuing to see is that these are very close elections. So, for example, the Kansas, the gubernatorial GOP primary is less than 200 votes right now that separate the lieutenant governor from the Chris Kobach, who served as the vice chair for the Election Integrity Commission that the president administered.
Well, again, he is running against an incumbent, and I'd love to hear from some of our Kansas listeners to see why that would even be that kind of a close race. But it illustrates a point again. Less than 200 votes out of 311,000 votes cast. And again, obviously there's going to be a recount there. Anytime it's usually within 0.5%, then they do so. There's no evidence necessarily that there has to be a recount in Ohio 12th, but again, recognize that you've got about, I think it's 3,435 provisional ballots. Now, some of those are going to get thrown out. I understand that, but some of them are, again, going to make a difference in who wins. And so too close to call in a couple of elections, either primaries or special elections. Is that a preview of coming attractions? Are we going to have some more close elections this fall?
Yeah, so I mean, you look at it. We'll go. I'm not, since it's just a primary. We'll move away from Kansas, and so let's just look at Ohio, for example. And so that Ohio, the 12th congressional district, that much attention is being given to because it's a special election, which beside the point, the fact that they're going to have another election in 3 months. Yeah. And so they're spending upwards, candidates have spent upwards of, I think, $4 million, not a piece, $4 million total for the race, and no telling how much. It's always really hard to figure out how much the actual state put into actually administering and facilitating the actual election, the special election, rather. But I think one of the interesting things is when you see kind of the context and the history of that particular district, it has been obviously never this close in recent history. It's usually been very red. I don't want to say very red.
Double digit. John Kasich district.
Yeah. It's 11 points that President Trump won it by. So there's that number. But I'm always a little hesitant. Like, so yes, it was 11 points, but also he only got 53% of the vote, which is still 11 points. But then you look at Balderson. Balderson got 50% of the vote, is what it looks like, 50 point something. So it's not too far wide, but it does indicate that it appears as though Democrats are closing the gap on some of these specifically some of these congressional elections right now, which is just going to be very interesting when you consider 3 months from now.
Well, again, let's talk about money, because one of the articles you've posted, and I would encourage people to go to the website, pointofview.net, actually has a quote, interestingly enough, from individuals kind of looking at money, and one of those individuals is Corey Bliss. You might say, who is he? Well, he's executive director of the Congressional Leadership Fund, and basically he sent out a summary and a statement to everybody saying, look, my super PAC cannot possibly keep spending more money than the Democrats do in every district, as we did in Ohio. So between the amount of money that was spent in this particular 12th congressional district special election, and in addition to the president coming and doing a rally, you can't multiply that 435 times, because there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. Now, again, recognize most of these races are already decided. I could tell you right now, going down the list, how 400 of them are going to go without blinking an eye. But it's those last 30 or 40 that actually could make the difference. And in particular, you can identify easily about 24 to almost 36 races that could be toss-up kind of races. And we're broadcasting right now in a congressional district that is now rated as a toss-up. And so just get a few more of those, and Democrats get turnout, they get money, they get some enthusiasm, and Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House next term.
I think one of the things that I think is very clear to see is important, and the reason why I'm a little bit more of the mindset of a special election is just that it's special. You can't project onto the larger. It's because in a special election, all attention can be given. So you've got the national figures that are coming in, like President Trump. You've got the money that's coming in. That's much more than traditionally is put into one of these races. Now, I think that's why I'm a little bit more of the mind that, lo and behold, it's just different. You can't project what happens in a special election onto the general or onto the midterm, whatever the big election day is. That's more nationwide. What I do think is going to be interesting, though, is that, one, you recognize that you're not going to be able to have all these significant figures that are moving in.
That's very true.
And two, you're not going to have the amount of money that's going to be pouring in equally. But one of the things that's in the Democrats' favor right now is they have been able to motivate. Now, granted, it's money outside of the district, but they've refused to, many of them have refused to take some of this PAC money, and they're able to get these little $20 donations, these $40, $50 donations, and really just a lot of those small donations. And it's more than just money to be able to make signs and put up flyers and advertisements on the radio and TV and stuff. But really, that money indicates if it's in the district, those are not only just people that are going to vote for you, those are people that are going to drive buses for you to get a lot of other people that might not have supported you financially, but are indicative of their putting ownership in that campaign, which I think is the reason why I'm more of the mind that, and I hope that I'm wrong, that there will be a blue wave in 2018.
Well, and again, let's look at momentum, because if indeed big dollars make a difference, they didn't make a difference for some of the Democrats back in 2010 and 2014, the other midterm elections. You had money from George Soros, you had money from Tom Steyer. We can go through the long list of big donors, and yet because of the Tea Party rallies and because of just a concern about Obamacare and a number of other things, Republicans made enormous gains in 2010 and 2014. Now things seem to be a little bit reversed, because now there are those who maybe are saying, well, maybe Donald Trump was an anomaly, maybe he isn't, maybe I like the fact that I got a tax cut, but I don't like his tweets, whatever it might be. And the momentum does seem to be in the hands of the Democrats. And, of course, they still have that money. But, again, you also see, can I mention this, Donald Trump going out of his way sometimes to create stirring things up in Ohio. I'd love to hear from our Ohio listeners what they thought about his comments about LeBron James. Yeah. Did that help? I can't imagine that helped. I think it hurt. And then you have the money on the Republican side from the Koch brothers, and he picked a fight with them as well. So are the Koch brothers not going to be involved in some of these campaigns? The bottom line is, I think before it's all through, the big money is not going to be as significant. What is significant are the people that give the $25 donations. They put a sign in their yard. They make the phone calls. They tell their neighbors to go out and vote, and sometimes they pick them up and take them to the polls. And that's how these elections are going to be won, I think.
And I'd love to hear from you. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. Or you can get on Facebook, facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Leave a little question or comment in the box underneath the live video feed, and then we'll share that on what you share online. We'll share over the air. Kerby, here's the optimistic side of me. I don't want to say the optimistic side. Let's just look at context and history from our perspective. We've been very supportive of the president. I would say that we've championed, or we haven't championed, probably is the wrong word. We want to celebrate when we think that he's doing right things. So when it comes to the religious liberty clauses, we want to be the first ones to celebrate. When it comes to what he's done with ISIS, first ones to celebrate. When it comes to the North Korea overtures, celebration. Tax regulation, celebrate. Deregulation, celebrate. There's been a lot of good things that the president has done. But at the end of the day, I think the American people really are. They're good people. We're good people at the very core. And I think what President Trump has done more than anything is he has really revealed certain individuals that have either, especially from a Christian perspective, I would say have idolized whoever is in that office, right? To the extent that faithful are the wounds of a friend. If you cannot wound your friend, if you cannot speak dissent against your friend when he's violating or when he's doing wrong things, then I just wonder. I think that really speaks ill, not necessarily of the person that's done the wrong, but of the person that's tried to justify the wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably, especially from a millennial perspective, I think it's been very revealing relative to this Trump era that we're living in right now.
Well, and a little bit later, we're going to talk about Sarah Jeong, and again, you see the liberals trying to justify racist takes.
Like literally, it just befuddles me. And I know I'm cutting you off right now.
No, but I said in some respects this is a theme that's going to run through the show. I think in part because you were talking about Donald Trump, we can talk about Sarah Jeong. Of course, we haven't even got into some of the other individuals like Alex Jones being banned. So this will be a theme. It wasn't intended, but I think it's going to be one that surfaces over the next 2 hours.
Yeah, I think we're just increasingly, we're good people that want to make sure that there's good people that are going to fight for us and that are going to advocate for our causes. And what's been so frustrating, I would say, from a millennial perspective, you have these inauthentic people that are driven by the Nietzschean will to power, and just how negative that might be able to be. And then the consequences of that is what I predict what we'll see in November, which is just a lot of individuals that are looking for jobs. And we'll be back right after this.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for $1? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear Point of View not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year, and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable with Kerby Anderson. And one of the interesting things is we've been taking some of your questions and comments relative to the special election, and is there going to be an impending blue wave, red wave? I don't claim to be a weather forecaster, but I would imagine that I've got about a similar success rate of about 40% with weathercasters, and so I think that's
which is better than some of them 2 years ago for the presidential election, right?
So
yes.
We've been taking some of your questions and comments, and you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And John Thornburg writes in on Facebook, and he says special elections are hard to read. Both sides can spend assets for a special election that they can't on the general election. Kind of the thrust of what he's saying is there are a lot of Americans that are getting tired of the corruption of the Democrats, and I don't think there will be a blue wave in the House, which I think is the corruption theme is something that we're all frustrated with right now on both sides of the aisle. I know John points out on the left side of the aisle, but I think we can again, we have an individual that just got indicted today, or rather arrested earlier today. That was a Republican. Not Chris Coons. No, but I think corruption just appears to be a main theme that many of us are just frustrated with and are ready to move from.
And the real issue is, of course, as we've talked about, since this is the Millennial Roundtable, we don't have all our millennials with us, but next week maybe we can get back to that whole full Millennial Roundtable, is that there is a level of cynicism, of skepticism that a lot of voters have, including the millennials. Now, does that cynicism or skepticism result in, let's throw the rascals out, and an anti-incumbent fervor? That's one possibility. Or does it just lead to people that say, I'm just not going to vote, And so whether it's the issue of corruption, whether it's the sense that Congress, and we haven't mentioned this, is not really doing anything. And by the way, if I can make one obvious prediction, which I can say with certainty, is if indeed the Democrats do control the House and Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House and the Republicans retain control of the Senate, which is at least a possibility, you will get nothing done in the next 2 years. It's hard enough to get things done right now. And as we even talked about yesterday with Star Parker, this piece of legislation, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation, 360 members, 130 of which were Democrats, voted for the prison reform bill and went to the Senate. So this is not one where it's just the Republicans passing it. It's Republicans and Democrats passing this particular piece of legislation that goes to the Senate. And there it goes to languish once again. So, again, at least hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation passed the House, went to the Senate, didn't go anywhere. But if you then don't even have legislation coming out of the House that people can agree with, and it's dead on arrival in the Senate, you really will have a dysfunctional government. And then I really do wonder what the elections in 2020 will look like, because then people will be so upset with the lack of movement in the Congress that, and maybe even in the presidency, that they may throw all the rascals out. We'll see.
Yeah, so corruption, just the lack of movement. And so what I was referring to, John, is that just earlier today, New York Congressman Chris Collins was charged with insider trading.
Yeah.
So it wasn't Chris Coons. Chris Coons is the senator from, I believe, Connecticut.
Right,
and
Connecticut.
Collins is a representative out of New York, and he's on the Republican side. But again, like what you've mentioned, is that corruption's not just limited to one side; it's really on both sides, which I think is another reason why there's just so much frustration and anger right now. Because at the end of the day, many Americans, we're hardworking Americans. We're working 47 hours a week on average, up 90 minutes from a decade ago. We know what it's like to have to go in and go out and to work our day's wages. And then if we don't do our work, we know what it's like to get fired. Some of us know what it's like to get fired. But yet we continue to send the congressmen up there, and we're just wondering, what are you getting done right now?
What are you doing? Yeah.
And so we're just projecting the expectations that we have from our bosses, and just very frustrated right now, Kirby. And so whether it's the corruption piece,
that's right,
or just looking to what 2018, if the Democrats do win over the House, what is it going to look like? It just seems that it will be individuals that are talking past one another, talking directly to the bases, and it goes back to the same old lines of, you've got to give us control, you got to give us more power, you got to give us more power to accomplish what we want to get done.
It hasn't worked very well,
and it hasn't worked very well for a long time. And so, what will that look like? And so, but it does reveal something too, which kind of transitions us over to our second piece that we've been talking about, is the idea, and this is the second article that's on the website at pointofview.net, this idea of corruption and hypocrisy that is just rank right now, not only in Washington, but also the latest move by the New York Times. And it's just frustrating, Kirby, especially from the millennial standpoint, where there's just a high value that's placed on authenticity, that you have the rationalization by the New York Times. It wasn't an apology that they issued. The rationalization that they issued relative to bringing on Sarah Jong, who they hired as a tech writer, but also invited to join their op-ed board, and just some of the vile comments that she made online and that she has refused to apologize for makes us continually aware that everybody wants to say that racism has only intensified because of President Trump. Well, President Trump might be a source of it, but there are others that are equally influencing and poisoning, I would say, the well.
Well, again, let's be honest about the fact that Sarah Jong has been doing this for some time. Yep. We have on this program, so that people don't say we're being hypocritical, complained that Ryan Bounds, who was being considered for the Ninth Circuit Court, that his name was pulled out of nomination because of something he said when he was at Stanford. I think at 19 years of age. That's unfair. Or we can talk about some of the flamboyant things that Kevin Williamson said when he was hired then by Atlantic and then fired, and even, you can pick Ben Shapiro, all that. She's been saying these for years, and they're more vile than anything I can possibly say on the air, and I wouldn't. And so it's saying this about men, it's saying this about white men, it's saying this about various people in law enforcement, and on and on and on and on. And so as a result, the way it's being defended is not that, well, these are just a few comments, because there were too many of those. It's been defended of saying, well, these might look to you like it's racist, but they're not, because after all, she's Korean, she's Asian, so she can't be racist. And that gets us into a word called intersectionality, which is a theory that says, well, there is a ranking of victims, and so if you're a black woman, you get a twofer. In other words, you're not just black, but you're also a woman. If you're a black woman lesbian, then you're a threefer, if you see what I'm saying here. Yeah. And so because she's a woman, because she's Asian, a number of other things, she is a victim, and victims can't be racist. And that argument maybe makes some sense on a college campus, but it makes no sense out here in the real world, does it?
It's just frustrating because, again, at the end of the day, many of our listeners can attest that we're just all accountable for our words.
Sure.
Like, especially from the biblical narrative, for those that are listening that are Christians, we recognize it to be true that there's great weight that's placed upon our words. That's why James says it's like a rudder on a ship, right? That the mouth can speak life, but it can also speak death. And some of the comments that we can't repeat them on air.
Yeah.
Because I know my grandmother would hop on a flight, even though she doesn't fly, she'd hop on a flight just to whoop my tail right now if I were to say some of that stuff, because it's just atrocious, some of the words that she used.
It should never be said, and it shouldn't be condoned. And I think first of all, let's just be honest. The New York Times or Atlantic or anybody else, MSNBC, they have the right to hire her.
Yeah.
Not saying that she should be fired, like they fired Kevin Williamson. Not saying that they should withdraw the invitation, like they withdrew the opportunity for Ryan Bounds to serve on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals because of something, and it was really just a silly comment, but it was something when he was in college, and this man has been a judge all these years. These are the ways in which the games are played against anybody that might be seen as a conservative. When it goes the other direction and say, wait a minute, you have one of yours that's actually more egregious and more vile and more aggressive than any of these others that have lost their job, they all go, no, that's okay, because after all, she's an Asian woman and she's probably been exploited. No, she hasn't. She went to Berkeley and Harvard Law School and comes from a very affluent family, by the way. Korean Americans actually have a higher median income than Anglo-Americans, for example, but nevertheless, they just try to justify it, and I just don't think it works.
It's just frustrating, and so what it causes for us to be able to recognize is we might be frustrated with it, we might lament it, but we can't act like we're not acknowledged. We have to acknowledge it now, and how do we change that behavior? We'll talk a little bit more about how conservatives, how Christians are going to have to change their behavior in this new crazy world, and how they might be able to change the culture in order that we might not be able to have just in a shocking twist, we might be able to call racism for what it is, evil, and then move from that. But we'll also be taking some of your phone calls. What do you think about the New York Times hiring just this individual that has racist tendencies? You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212. You can read the article we've been talking about at pointofview.net. We'll give you some of the background. Or you can hop your way over to facebook.com/pointofviewradio and share your question or comment in the live video box. But we're going to take a break, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. You probably know the story of Aaron and Melissa Klein, the bakers in Oregon forced out of business and fined $135,000 by the state when they politely declined business that would have forced them to violate their religious convictions. What you may not know is that after the state of Oregon pronounced them guilty of discrimination, private citizens were eager to show their contempt for the Kleins. Many of the comments they received are so vulgar that I cannot repeat them here, but here is a tame sampling. One person writing in on Facebook said to the Kleins, "I hope your shop burns." Another chimed in, noting that she hoped Aaron and Melissa would burn in hell. One man sent a message that said, "I hope you lose your house and have to live on the streets." One woman even said, "We hope your children get cancer and die." When the government declares that citizens like Aaron and Melissa are not entitled to the Constitution's promises of religious liberty and free speech, its people push aside any goodwill that allows people to coexist peacefully with beliefs with which they may disagree. Aaron and Melissa have asked the Oregon Supreme Court to review their case. We hope the court will accept the appeal, if only to remind everyone that it is possible to live peacefully as neighbors, even when we disagree. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hey, and welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. I almost called you Sarah Jong. But
that's okay.
No.
I have not used those words. And by the way, I might just hasten to add, I do this every once in a while, a parental advisory. The second article does have, now they just like F blank or whatever, but they have a lot of the tweets. So first of all, if anybody's out there and they say, "Oh yeah, I want to read this to my kids," no, you don't. Okay. And so these are, we don't post these because we want you to use these words, right? Your grandma would tell us never to use these
Andrew,
words.
I'm going to need you to watch out for Kirby's mic. He's using harsh letters right now.
So there's the point, and so that's kind of what, but again, also, first of all, parental advisory, but number two, I think some people just say, no, you have got to be overplaying this. New York Times would never hire somebody that had these kind of vile comments. You must be taking them out of context. So that's why we wanted you to read the story so that you could see it for yourself.
And I think that's one of the interesting things, because I think a general human principle is that individuals are a little bit more, I would say, liberal, a little bit more loose in person than they are in public, or in private than they are in public.
Right.
And so what she's aired in public, I can only imagine comments that she makes in private.
I have heard some of the audio. Some people have been playing some of the audio of things she said when she was at Harvard and things like that, and those are horrific too. I mean, you just think, this is a woman that gets up every morning and is angry at everybody and is convinced that she is a victim, and everybody that's a minority, everybody's a woman, is a victim, and the police are actually out here to kill us all off. I mean, you just really come away going, what is in this woman's mind?
And so I think this is where we'll go into practicality for this last segment. Is I think it's going to be important for us just to recognize that this is reality, right? Like, I can't acknowledge. I think it's very easy for us to be able to identify, and I think we've done a really good job of identifying problems, inconsistencies in logic, just intellectual dishonesty. And this is just reality. And so because of that, how do we respond in light of reality? There's a part of me, obviously, that wants to try to change the system. And that doesn't mean that I want Sarah fired. It just means that I just think that I want them to acknowledge wrong, because I think it's important for us to have to a certain degree, to have a common sense of what's right and wrong, what can be perpetuated and what shouldn't be perpetuated. So how's the Christian supposed to respond to this, Kerby? As I'm thinking about this, does that mean, do we just stop reading the New York Times? How do we use our Twitter account now? How do we make that our social media profile? How do we express ourselves? I think those are a lot of questions right now that many Christians are just having to ask right now in this new world, where it seems as though if you're not a white person, you've got to be extra, or if you're not a white person, I'm just very confused.
Well, it seems to me that, first of all, we can look at what's happening in the world, but we should look at our behavior first. Mm-hmm. And in 1 Peter 2, it talks about the fact that we should keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles. Now, recognize that Peter's writing this to individuals who were Jewish, now Christian, although some might have been Gentiles who became Christians. They're suffering persecution. Now, that would be a tendency, I think, on my part. If somebody threw water in my face or put a bullhorn in my face, we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. And maybe when I'm eating breakfast in Philadelphia, I'm just using not a hypothetical, but a real situation for me to react. But again, Peter says that we should keep our behavior excellent before the Gentiles, so that the thing which they slander you as evildoers, because of your good deeds, they'll observe those and ultimately glorify God in the day of visitation. So it seems to me, first of all, we should be people of integrity. I think we should be individuals that practice civility, even in a culture that has become so degraded that a woman like this can be on the editorial board of the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Now, should we be surprised about that? Paul's writing this, and Peter's writing this, and James is writing this at a time when Nero is what?
Yeah.
The Caesar.
Yep.
So if it was true in the first century, it should be true in the first century. 21st century. So the bottom line is, first of all, we need to look to ourselves. Number two, we do not have to endorse that. And I think there's a place for us to speak out and to recognize that sometimes we are called as believers to speak the truth in love. Mm-hmm. So that means we can call out immoral behavior, call out profanity and profane comments, and say that those are wrong, and recognize that we might sometimes suffer the consequences. Oh, you're just a do-gooder, or you Christians, whatever. But I just think that's the kind of response that we should have in a culture that has really gone downhill. And I think if you needed any more illustrations, we'll probably in the next hour have a few more that we'll put on the table.
Yeah, I think there's a part of it that we want to be able to protest the system, right? And I don't mean boycott the New York Times, because at the end of the day, I'm still going to read the Times every morning. I'm going to still read the Times quite a bit, the website rather. So there's a part of it that I want to identify, and I want to fight against the system that can, again, because if I'm a person that's of truth, I want to fight against the system that's perpetuating what I would consider an unhealthy reality that they're perpetuating, rather. So there's that part, which, and again, I think that I go back to Bayard Ruskin, right? So Bayard Ruskin, who's the aesthetic and who's the artist, he says, if you want to reduce the ugliness in the world, you reduce the ugliness in yourself.
Right.
It kind of goes back to the biblical principle.
And focus on beauty, too.
Yeah. And so it goes back to the biblical principle of the idea that if I want to call out the specks that are in other people's eyes, I want to take the log out of my own. And so there should be a level of introspection as well. Is there elements of my life that are not glorifying to God? Are there components of my life that I need to work on in order to look more like Jesus? There's that part. And then I think it's really important, especially for millennial listeners, to be able to understand is that everything you put online, everything that you search for online,
thank you for doing that.
Everything online will be revealed. Whether Jesus does it or whether a journalist does it, it's all going to come out eventually. So check yourself before you wreck yourself, right?
Good line.
It's the reality. I'm always shocked day in and day out.
I am amazed.
All of these allegations and all of these individuals that are doing these things online, thinking they're going to get away with it, which is just a complete lie now, Kirby. No one's going to, all your old tweets, all those pictures, they're all going to come out eventually. So what are you doing? What are you doing when you know that it's wrong and you're putting it out in the light and thinking that everyone's going to forget about it just because it was a couple of years ago? Everything's going to come out.
Before we had social media, we used to joke about the fact that we sometimes would get angry letters to us written in crayon. Of course, that was a joke, but it was just barely a joke.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we get these tweets. But again, when you look at them and they just don't even have basics in terms of punctuation, capitalization, grammar, whatever. And it's just hard not to take it seriously. Mm-hmm. And, so that's another part of that as well. But going back to the key point, any young person right now just needs to listen to this one more time. Mm-hmm. They're about ready to go back to school. And if you happen to be listening here, your parents are forcing you to listen to it. Or if you're a parent or a grandparent, you need to just explain to them that they think this real cute little tweet or this picture or this YouTube video or this Snapchat, and those are indeed things that actually exist. You can tell me as a millennial that I'm not making these up. That these are very significant. And there are times when I have not only taken the time to look at a person's resume, but I'll find their name and I'll see if I can find them on Facebook or I can find them on Twitter or I can find them on Instagram or Pinterest or wherever it might be. And that's really eye-opening. And they think that it's just there for the moment, but it has a perpetuity that can affect them for the rest of their lives.
Yep, I completely agree. And so we're going to have to take a break, but when we come back from the break, we'll talk a little bit more about Sarah Jeong, some of her comments and what they reveal about the New York Times and the direction that they're going. But we'll also be talking about specifically Alex Jones, who's the founder of InfoWars and who's the loud voice that has been some individuals. He's put out some pretty anti-Semitic stuff. He's also put out some Sandy Hook conspiracies as well as others that are just that I would vehemently disagree with. But yet now he's kind of got my support to a certain degree because some of the big tech companies have decided to censor him. We're going to talk the break right after this.
Imagine a police officer telling you you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net because $1 really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
Yeah. Welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. You caught our conversation. They caught our conversation.
That's good, though. That's good, because we have said before we should keep these microphones on during the breaks, because we learn so many things from each other.
Exactly.
We try to pass some of them on during the breaks. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, some lessons we're learning about writing. We were just talking about, when we write and how we write. Mm-hmm. And again, if I can say that, one of the articles here is the Daily Briefing.
Hey.
And you write that every single day. And so that is, anybody wants to get an update on the elections or some of these other issues we're talking about, we can find it at the website pointofview.net, which will take you to the Daily Briefing, or go to thebriefing.net, right?
Yeah, so it moves into that. So this is the third hour, and so during the first 2 hours, we were talking about the election during the first hour and the implications for what's going to happen in 2018, potentially in the fall, the November elections. We were talking a little bit about Sarah Zhang and the New York Times recently hiring her and bringing her onto the editorial board, and some of the words that she said. And now I guess this is just kind of a natural segue when we talk about some of these words. Like I write, and Kerby knows this because Kerby's putting out, I don't know how Kerby writes as much as he does with all these books that he's putting out, as well as the commentary that they put out through Point of View. And so it just requires you, as Kerby has reminded me through Francis Bacon, reading makes a fool man, discussion makes a ready man, and writing makes a precise man. And this idea of writing really just, it follows you too. Like there's no getting around it. Like, so for example, CNN uncovered some of Mike Pence, Vice President Pence's writings on kind of the morality of President Clinton, and it still followed him all these days. And now we're just seeing the power of words, right? We're seeing the power of words in the past. And now we're beginning to see potentially some censorship of some of these words, especially relative to Alex Jones, who is the founder and kind of the lead talking head for InfoWars. And we reference this. This is the third article on the Point of View website. But one of the fascinating things is that now there is just a select group of individuals that represent 3 companies that have more or less completely removed Alex Jones from the internet and InfoWars from the internet. Obviously, we're talking about Google, YouTube, Facebook have removed him from the internet. What was the other two? It was YouTube. Was it YouTube, Google, Facebook? I feel like there was one more that I'm missing out on.
Because we are talking about that other one.
And so they've censored him from the internet. They've decided to move him off of that, which is just a really interesting move now, because now we're asking the question of, is this a smart thing? Now, obviously, some background. Alex Jones has said some very awful comments. He's made some anti-Semitic remarks that were just very unnecessary, untactful. I would very much unbiblical. He said some comments relative to some conspiracy theories, Pizzagate, for example, Sandy Hook, for example. Some that the government is turning the frogs homosexual is another one. He mongers and he kind of does business and shop and some of these conspiracy theories. But is it right for a couple of individuals at these technology companies to more or less just shut him down? Which I think, Kerby, is just something that we're eventually going to have to come to, because it seems as though that there are some that are saying, yes, they should shut him down because the speech that he's using is hateful. And there are others that are shutting him down and saying, yeah, I don't like the things that he said, but I don't think they should censor him for it.
Yes, and again, this is one of those issues where I think the comments that are being made right now by the big tech four And let me call them the big tech three, because Twitter has explained why they don't think that they need to ban Alex Jones. So again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. That's why this piece by David French, who was sitting in this chair just a couple months ago when he was in town, and will come back and spend some time with us again, makes the case that, again, what he says sometimes is loathsome. Certainly, again, a free market allows a private company to decide whether they want him on a platform, but there's a bigger issue, and he calls it a better way to ban Alex Jones. Hate speech right now is the most vague, undefined term. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center can say, well, the Alliance Defending Freedom is a hate group, but First Liberty, that Kelly Shackelford is a part of, is not a hate group. Does that make any sense? They're basically doing the same thing. An organization I've worked with for years is a hate group, but Point of View is not a hate group. I mean, after a while, you can see that it's very vague, and it's so open to subjective interpretation. So David French makes the case, we do have a corpus of law dealing with libel and slander. So if you're going to actually deal with somebody, let's at least have precise definitions, which over centuries now have been honed down, rather than just say, well, I don't like what that person says. No, do I not like what Alex Jones says? No. But that's not the point. If I have a public forum, he can have the freedom to say it. And if I like bad speech, let's produce more good speech to counteract it. Let's come up with better arguments to show why his particular viewpoint is wrong, rather than censor them. And yet, of course, the mindset right now out of the university campuses, which you and I have talked about, is when I dislike what you have to say, you don't have any more opportunity to say it in any kind of forum.
And I think that's one of the interesting things you bring up, is the idea, okay, so we might disagree with him. We might find some of the things that he says repugnant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should silence him, because, again, then that hinders us from better understanding, one, from a Christian perspective, who are others that agree with him that we might be able to persuade towards, I would argue, a better way. But then, too, we never really understand where that person particularly stands because their voice has been silenced. So I think that there's a biblical case to be made. I tried to make it a couple of days ago in the daily briefing, and I got quite a bit of pushback from it because I said kind of my working thesis was the idea that when speech is censored, truth is threatened. And because at the end of the day, I think we see in one of the verses we always go back to is Isaiah 1:18, where it says that come, let us reason together, come, let us argue together. It's literally what the Hebrew is saying. And then you can see instances all throughout the biblical narrative where God invites individuals to argue with him. You can see it all the way from, you can see it with Abram when it comes to Sodom. You can see it with Moses when it comes to moving to smiting and killing off all the Israelites in Exodus 32. You can see it with Hezekiah wanting to extend his life. You can see it even with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but your will be done. You can see it in Jonah. There are various descriptive instances that we can see in the biblical narrative where God invites and God allows for dissenting opinion. And to a certain degree, even hateful speech comes from that. We can look to Jeremiah, for example, in Jeremiah 9, where Jeremiah calls God an unreliable stream. He calls him unfaithful to God's faith, which is just
the book of Job. How about that?
A book of Job, exactly. And so we see these instances that are, for a Christian, it would be, well, that's not that you're giving God attributes that he's not. You're blaspheming his name. You're misrepresenting him. Don't we want to represent him? And I would argue, yes, we want to represent him, but we want to represent him not only to believers, but also to individuals that have misconceptions about who he is. And one of the ways that we can identify that and do that is through free speech. Free speech allows individuals to be able to give voice to what they really believe. And then hopefully we can bring about the biblical narrative in order that hearts might be warmed, according to Luke 24. I've talked way too much right now. We're going to take a break. We're going to continue talking about free speech, and because I think I've got a biblical argument for it. And we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Even though there's lots of evidence that violence is declining, many people don't believe it. On my radio program, we have documented that the violent crime rate has dropped significantly over the last few decades. And if you want a longer look at the decline in violence over millennia, you can pick up the 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. Apparently, many people don't believe it. That is why he spends a few pages in his 2018 book, Enlightenment Now, trying to answer some of the skeptical comments and questions. Here are a few of his responses. Some wonder how you can say violence has decreased when we hear about school shootings and terrorist bombings. He points out that decline is not the same thing as disappearance. Something can decrease quite a bit without vanishing altogether. The best way to examine the level of violence is to look at the level today and compare it to the level in the past. Others argue that all of these statistics mean nothing if you are one of the victims. That is certainly true, but it also means that you are less likely to be a victim. All of the stories about civil wars, terrorist attacks, and other examples of violence make us feel like the world is more dangerous than it was in the past. He has even heard people charge him with being naive, sentimental, idealistic, and romantic because he says violence has gone down. He merely says, look at the data. To look at the data and say that violence has gone up is delusional. To ignore the data and say that violence has gone up is to be a know-nothing. This discussion about violence is yet another reminder that there is often a major difference between perception and reality. That is why we need to do good research and exercise discernment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. And now I'm going to pass the plate now because I was preaching.
You're doing good, though.
How
could I
the
disagree?
Previous segment,
yeah.
And trying to make a biblical case for this idea of free speech. And you know, Kerby, there's been instances, and we were going back and forth during the break, of individuals that have said that Christians are individuals that are trying to silence speech, or Christians are the ones that are trying to squelch the idea of free speech. But that's just not correct, right?
I just have trouble finding that. You know, again, if I had Bill Maher here right now, he'd say, well, what about the Catholic Church? Okay, that was an institutional structure that maybe tried to. But if you want to understand what we consider to be the modern idea of free speech, you are going back to individuals that were influenced by the Reformation. They were influenced by the Renaissance. Even the other day, I saw this Jonah Goldberg. He was talking about, you know, the idea of liberty and free speech, and he gives at least credit to John Locke. And I said, it's interesting because he was saying, well, there's, you know, Christians really had no influence. I said, John Locke, you mean the person that quotes from the Bible 1,000 times in the first treatise of government and 300 times quotes from the Bible in the second treatise of government? You mean that John Locke, you know? How about Montesquieu, and how about Milton? And you just go through and recognize, you and I know enough about European history to be dangerous to know that most of these ideas that we have about free speech come primarily from Christians. I'll give partial credit to some secular humanists that fit into that category as well, Voltaire being one that certainly could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church, who still said, I would defend you. But most of those ideas come from a Christian worldview. Why? Because everybody is created in the image of God. We recognize that we should always turn away anger with a gentle answer. There's an emphasis to treat others as we would like to be treated, the golden rule, that we should be civil towards one another. Those are all principles that you find in Scripture, and when Christians live those out, we are the most gracious individuals and will allow people to have disagreements and then try to use logic and persuasion and love to convince them, but we don't use coercion. Well, where does coercion come from? From totalitarians. Our conversation yesterday from Dinesh D'Souza, whether it's Mussolini, whether it's Hitler, whether it's Mao, wherever it might be, those are totalitarian atheist regimes that want to squelch any kind of controversy, any kind of contrary point of view. Christians have always been one to say, look, we are going to use two weapons, love and truth. I'm going to speak the truth in love and make a difference in our communities and our world.
And so we want to practice what we preach right now and allow you the opportunity to exercise your free speech. So you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. What do you think about the big tech companies silencing, censoring, and pretty much kicking Alex Jones and InfoWars off? Think this is a threat to free speech? Do you think that foreboding and maybe things to come when they encounter hate speech, but what we call Christian doctrine? We'd love to hear from you. 800-351-1212. Or you can go on to Facebook.com. Ironically, you can go on to Facebook.com, Point of View Radio /Point of View Radio, and share your question or comment. I think one of the things, though, we continue to argue we argue with one. We don't necessarily argue with one another. I'm arguing with the hypothetical that's coming on the side. So you argued with a hypothetical Bill Maher just now. I'm going to argue with an individual. I wrote about this during the daily briefing the other day, and there was an individual that brought up the point that I said that we want to not only be the fiercest advocates of free speech, but I added the clause, even when that speech is against God and is contrary to biblical narrative. And then I had an individual that came back to me and said so we're encouraging individuals to be blasphemous. We're encouraging individuals to say unbiblical and ungodly things. Well, I would say that there's a difference between encouraging them and then allowing them an opportunity to do that. Because again, at the end of the day, and I think you mentioned it over the break, we can make better arguments.
Right.
It kind of goes back to the John Milton quote that I often quote. It's the idea of what it says, since let truth and falsehood wrestle in a field, for I've never known truth to be put asunder. We should want to have some of these honest debates, because we know that there are doubting Thomases that are asking to be able to see the hands of Jesus. We know that there are Corneliuses that are wanting to run up to us. And if we don't have the freedom and the capacity and create atmospheres whereby these individuals might come, whereby these individuals might ask questions, it not only hinders them, but also it does a detriment to the gospel message that we have to allow them to be able to move that forward. And one of the things that I'm increasingly, you see the tea leaves in the air right now, is that when they censor Alex Jones for some of the disgusting things that he said, yes, we can do that, but we can also hold in the other hand, which again is kind of the Voltaire perspective of, when are we going to be the next ones, right? When we refute, our views on transgender, our views on homosexual marriage, our views on the exclusivity of salvation in Jesus, those are what the Bible calls stumbling blocks, what the culture calls hate speech. And so there's only a matter of time before they come for us as well. And so that's why I'm of the mind that I do not want to be associated with Alex Jones, but at the end of the day, I want to believe it to be true that I can hold two contrasting opinions together of supporting Alex Jones's right to say something and disagreeing vehemently with a lot of the things that he said, to such an extent that hopefully we can move towards a more prosperous and more free public community whereby we can disagree with one another in an open dialogue.
And back to your argument from your friend or maybe your enemy, or your comment that, are we encouraging blasphemy? No. What we're doing is we are allowing people to express a point of view, but we also can warn them about the dangers of that point of view. And if you say, no, there's never a place where I can question God, well, then take it up with Job. Take it up with David in some of the Psalms. Take it up with Jeremiah, which we just mentioned a minute ago. Take it up perhaps even, as I was just quoted in the last hour, 1 Peter, with some of the Christians who Peter's writing to that are wondering whether or not when's the coming of the return of the Lord. I mean, there have always been doubts and questions and sometimes pretty bold statements made by some of the men and women of God. And so if we can't recognize that God has allowed that for believers, why can we not at least allow that for unbelievers? But we can also, we don't, just because you have free speech doesn't mean you don't pay the consequences for free speech, right? And that is, just because somebody says some blasphemous things doesn't mean that you won't suffer the consequences for blasphemy. Just because you believe that, for example, sex outside of marriage is fine, or that same-sex marriage is okay, or that pornography is just neutral, doesn't mean that you won't pay the consequences for some of those things. And I think then is where we speak truth and love and say there are consequences to that kind of behavior. There are consequences to that kind of language, too.
And language, for better or for worse, has the capacity to be able to disrupt the status quo. And it's happened. And that's why our founders gave us this freedom of speech all the way back in the 18th century. They dreamed of this free speech, that individuals might be able to exchange ideas, recognizing that ideas have consequences and recognizing that ideas hold significant amount of power. And we don't have to go all the way back to the 18th century to recognize that. We can see that within our own lifetime, that thank God we had a country that had free speech in order that someone might be able to speak a word and say what's happening relative to the segregation of races is unacceptable. And they utilize their free speech in such a way to disrupt the cultural norms and the status quo in order that we might move to a more equitable and prosperous society whereby Jim Crow is 6 feet under, whereby segregation is no longer, it's no longer a law of the land, which is just another point, Kerby, that I think this is one of those things that we just want to be very cautious of when we're saying that we disagree with someone and we're trying to censor them. There's a distinction that needs to be made, and hopefully we can still all be active proponents of this idea of free speech, but recognize that when we're advocating for free speech, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm supporting the individuals that are trying to perpetuate some of their speech that we would consider disgusting.
Yes. So, well, and when we come back from the break, you were mentioning, is there a possibility that conservative speech could be banned? And this piece by Michael Brown, which might mention just a little bit later in the broadcast, illustrates that once you head down this road and say, well, we'll just censor Alex Jones, who's next? Yeah. And I think we know who's next. Yeah. You know, and as a matter of fact, it's a really creative way to begin to give you justification, to begin to weed out some of these, what, quote, are unpopular views.
Yeah. And so we know who's next. It's Michael Brown. But what's next is a commercial break. And so we're going to have to take one of those breaks. And so, but before we go to break, you can still call in, exercise your free speech on this particular issue. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. What do you think about the big tech companies censoring Alex Jones and InfoWars? 800-351-1212, or go on to facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Share your question or comment in the box, and then what you share online, we'll share over air as well. We'll be back right after this.
Just over 100 years ago, 2 or 3 cents would buy you what it takes $1 to buy today. What of any real value can you buy for $1? Well, how about this? How about enabling one listener to hear Point of View not just today, but for an entire year? You heard right. $1 makes it possible to reach a person through the radio or through any of our online channels for a year, and pays for all the other resources available through our website. All the interviews with special guests and public officials, all the information, all the training, all the inspiration and transformation for $1. How many dollars will you invest in the future of our nation? How many lives can you change with your investment today? Call right now and reach more people to help change our nation. 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson, and we've been talking about free speech, Kerby. And I mean, that commercial break silenced me, and now I'm going to express my snowflake, my feelings. I did not like being silenced right now, but nevertheless, we've been talking about free speech and specifically how Facebook and other tech companies have decided to band together not necessarily band together, but they came together and they announced a ban on Alex Jones and InfoWars. Some of the comments that he's made, anti-Semitic comments, some of the conspiracy theories that he's perpetuated out into the World Wide Webs. They said enough is enough. And so using their kind of vague hate speech policies, they've decided that they're going to go ahead and they banned him. And so now one of the interesting things that's happened, though, is, again, in a free market economy, that wherever there's a demand, there will be a supply. And so Alex Jones has doubled down and utilized this ban and has caused it. And he said individuals need to come to our website, they need to subscribe to our services, and they need to purchase merchandise and donate. And lo and behold, he is experiencing a significant surge right now. But time will tell if he can survive without some of those revenue streams that came from having a certain number of people watching on Facebook and YouTube, which just makes it very interesting.
And one other thing I wonder is some of this is perpetuated by kind of the liberal activist, and because Twitter has decided that he does not violate their policies, Twitter CEO, whose name is Jack Dorsey, who, by the way, in the past has been criticized because he wasn't liberal enough. You know, let's give credit where credit's due. Twitter has not banned InfoWars Alex Jones, so it will be interesting to see over the next few days whether or not he then, that is the head of Twitter, is criticized because he didn't follow suit with Facebook, YouTube, and Apple. So we'll see. We'll see. It's always something to talk about here on Point of View.
Yeah.
And we have some callers.
We'll get some callers right now. So you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number's 800-351-1212. Or jump on over to Facebook, facebook.com/Point of View Radio. We're going to jump on a phone call right now. We've got Robert right now. Robert, are you there?
Yeah.
Hey, Robert, what's your point of view?
Well, you know, the difference between religion and Christianity, religion, you got to do. Christianity, it's already done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's through Jesus Christ our Lord. You know, He paid the price for our salvation. And so there's no other way.
Yeah.
And that's my comment.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for that. I completely agree. It does change. One of the things that I think, the reasons why I think it's just so rich from the Christian tradition is because from a religious perspective, there's a sense that I'm trying to earn my right, and so there's this desperation. There can be ethical slips when you're trying to be very desperate in order to earn a right standing. But I think from the Christian perspective, when we recognize that Jesus has already done everything, it should bring a comfort, it should bring a calm, but also, more importantly, it should probably bring a confidence as well.
Confidence
in the discourse. So at the end of the day, individuals might not agree with me, but I know that what God started, He's going to see to completion, and He's called me, because of what He's already done, He's called me not necessarily to win souls, but just to sow seeds, be faithful in sowing seeds, which I think is one of the interesting and beautiful things about differentiating the Christian in the public square, Kerby, is the sense that there should be a confidence, because one, I've been before the King of Kings, so that should produce a confidence. And two, He's with me in this, and so I shouldn't feel intimidated or insecure by any of it.
Yeah, and again, that's helpful when you talk about doubt, because some people might raise a question, say, well, how do you know that's true? And say, look, I have confidence because, first of all, I've accepted Jesus Christ. Number two, the Holy Spirit comes and lives within me. Plus, of course, if you listen to this program, we give you lots of evidence for that. And so there's one source of confidence. But also, just even when you get in the political realm, you just say, well, you know, I'm going to give you my best arguments, and if my arguments fail, well, I don't worry about that because my trust is in God. And, of course, you've heard the old line, I've read the final chapter and I know who wins. So there's a sense in which there should be confidence in our Christian walk, and the Apostle Paul talks about that, that we should have confidence. So I appreciate Robert reminding us of that. And especially when we talk about this idea of speech, a Christian, I think, can allow a lot of different views to be presented and say, you know, I still believe that the Christianity is going to win. And I know that, one, because I trust in my Savior, and two, because of history. You know, truth ultimately wins. Yep. There are times when falsehood reigns, and there are times when we even read in the Psalms where David says, Why is it the evildoers are thriving right now? But those are only for a season.
Yep.
You know, truth ultimately is going to win out. If not in your lifetime, certainly by the end of the age.
And I think that's the reason why we have to be such fierce advocates for this free speech. Is because at the end of the day, it does allow us to exercise and exhibit that confidence that we have because of what Jesus has done. But also, too, it allows us to be able to hear some of those contrasting claims. And now, granted, some of those claims might be vitriolic. Some of those claims might lack tact. Some of those claims might be just blasphemous. But I gotta believe it to be true that my God has heard far worse than what's in front of me. And I know that because I saw what happened to his son on the cross, and he still defeated the cross. And so I think he can handle some of these words. And then it allows me to be able to give a proper response that hopefully represents and glorifies him to such an extent that might sow good seeds into souls. And so that's why I would argue that the Christian needs to stand with Alex Jones, even though some of his comments are so unbiblical, that we might be able to have our speech be matched with his, and hopefully the fragrant aroma of Christ will draw more individuals to us than it does to him. So, nevertheless, let's take one more call. We've got Jay in North Carolina right now. Jay, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Hey, Jay, what's your point of view?
I just heard what you said, and I'm still rather confused because Alex Jones is spewing this whole idea that it's a conspiracy to what happened in Parkland, Florida, with the kids who were actually shot. He was saying that these are probably actors, and this wasn't a real event.
Yeah,
that's confusing me.
Yeah. And so, Jay, this is the differentiation I would make. I don't believe anything, the conspiracy theories. I don't believe the conspiracy theories that I know. And one of those conspiracy theories that I know is the one that you're talking about, that the Parkland, as well as what happened in Newport, they used crisis actors to perpetuate this, and it didn't really happen. I think that's completely wrong. One of the things that, though, I will stand with Alex Jones on is I do want him to have the opportunity to speak those words. I think they're disgusting. I think that they're wrong, but I don't want a couple of people in Silicon Valley to have the opportunity as well as the capacity to silence him just because he's wrong. Does that make sense?
I understand your point of view. I don't agree with you, but I understand your point of view. Because
one of the things that I'm just a little cautious of, Jay, and I love how we can disagree with one another and still be civil with one another, is that I just don't know where it ends. Like, I can understand if they want. I think David French does this really well in his article. There's a difference that needs to be made between silencing someone that's utilizing hate speech and then silencing someone that's libel or is committing defamation. One of the things that what they've done is they've cited hate speech as the reason why they've shut him down. But what they haven't done is they haven't properly defined hate speech in their terms. And so when there's that vague, ambiguous definition of those words, who knows? Am I going to be an individual that perpetuates hate speech simply because I communicate biblical truth? That's where I'm a little bit. That's why I'm wanting to say I want to give Alex Jones a voice. But I want to also have a voice to be able to say, I think Alex Jones is completely wrong. I think he's unbiblical, and I think God is going to judge him.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking my call.
Oh, thank you so much for taking some time. So, Kerby, and that's what's really hard. I think a lot of people feel that way because there's Alex Jones. He's just said some very awful things, especially for some tender moments where there's been great tragedy. That individuals, it just seems it's just hard to say, I want to stand with somebody that's doing that. It just is really unpalatable to be able to do.
And when we come back from the break, maybe we could talk more about this idea of the conspiracy, because I know that Michael Medved used to have a conspiracy day where people would call in with their conspiracies. But the question you always have to have in the back of your mind, whether you're looking at Sandy Hook or whether you're looking at Parkland, is if indeed this is a big hoax and a conspiracy, sooner or later, something cracks. You know, somebody speaks out. Somebody says, no, that was fake. And that's the difficulty you have with whether or not, 9/11 was an inside job, or whether we faked the moon landing, or whether there was actors at Parkland, or whether or not Sandy Hook was an inside job, or whatever. You just say, most conspiracies break apart pretty quickly, and that's the question that you sometimes have to ask yourself. Just let me use logic and common sense for a minute And again, are there some conspiracies? Yeah. And every once in a while, Alex Jones has broken a story. And I wish he'd stay on the ones that we all agree with rather than go off on some of these that we all just roll our eyes at.
And when there's a crack in the conspiracy, I want to make sure that there's freedom of speech for me to be able to shine a light with my voice. And we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. You probably know the story of Aaron and Melissa Klein, the bakers in Oregon forced out of business and fined $135,000 by the state when they politely declined business that would have forced them to violate their religious convictions. What you may not know is that after the state of Oregon pronounced them guilty of discrimination, private citizens were eager to show their contempt for the Kleins. Many of the comments they received are so vulgar that I cannot repeat them here, but here is a tame sampling. One person writing on Facebook said to the Kleins, "I hope your shop burns." Another chimed in, noting that she hoped Aaron and Melissa would burn in hell. One man sent a message that said, "I hope you lose your house and have to live on the streets." One woman even said, "We hope your children get cancer and die." When the government declares that citizens like Aaron and Melissa are not entitled to the Constitution's promises of religious liberty and free speech, its people push aside any goodwill that allows people to coexist peacefully with beliefs with which they may disagree. Aaron and Melissa have asked the Oregon Supreme Court to review their case. We hope the court will accept the appeal, if only to remind everyone that it is possible to live peacefully as neighbors, even when we disagree. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Some people think our religious freedom will soon be gone, but that's not true. The fact is that First Liberty, a national network of America's top attorneys, is winning over 90% of our cases. We defend religious freedom for people like you. Go to firstliberty.org and read the exciting story. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back on Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Kerby Anderson. We've been talking about free speech, Kerby. Free speech. And even though we might disagree with certain speech, we should be fierce advocates for speech. And specifically, the instance that we've been talking about is Alex Jones and the InfoWars, how Facebook and Google and YouTube have censored him, have kind of kicked him off, and pretty much more or less silenced him from the internet. And we've been taking some of your phone calls as well. And so during this last segment, we'll continue taking some of your phone calls, and you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, 800-351-1212. We're going to hop on over to Holly in Arizona right now. Holly, are you there?
Yes, I am. How are you today?
Hey, Holly, I'm not doing too bad. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. I have an opportunity for a minute to speak to you on my lunch break. I'm actually working, but I listen to your program almost every day. Thank God I have this radio in the truck I drive. But I just wanted to comment on what you guys are talking about. I truly believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and God in heaven, and it just seems to be like the media and some of those people out there today that have control over certain things are trying to play God and tell us how to think and tell us what to say. And and ban our freedom of speech, and I disagree with it. When they're trying to play God like that, I think that, they're shoving the wrong things down our throats, such as free sexual immorality with, man with man, woman with a woman. I disagree with that. And we all have the right to believe how we want to. As the Bible says, let every man be persuaded in his own mind. But I'm just totally against the way they're trying to ban our speech, the freedom of our speech. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. Because again, at the end of the day, that's the beauty of America, right? Like, it's built upon, we've just got freedom that just saturates the air. And one of the reasons why we have that freedom is to be able to pursue after the happiness that we see fit, that we have a propensity and we have capacities to be able to ascertain what's the good I want to run after, and then to run after that good. And for religious people, specifically, that good looks radically different than other people's good. Like, I'm always captivated by what Jesus says in Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man finds and goes and hides again, and for joy sells everything in order to secure the field. Like, not everybody has found the treasure, and not everybody wants to sell everything to get that field. But for those of us, the 30-something odd % of us that follow Jesus and are going to church and getting in the Word and following after Christ and kind of taking up our cross, denying ourselves and following after Him, we found the treasure. And I love that we have the freedom not only to be able to to sell everything to go get the field, but also to be able to tell everybody about the treasure we found hidden in a field.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yep. Hey, I think my point is, it just frustrates me that they're in more than one level trying to play God out there, and they're not my God, and I know they're not your God either. So.
Well said.
Yeah, and Holly, one of the things that we can take great comfort in is if we look to the past, we can see pretty clearly into the future, as Winston Churchill said. As we look at the past, there's been other false gods that have tried to, but they've ended up either smolted or fallen on their face, wondering what in the world is going on. So, Holly, thank you.
Praise God for that.
That is the truth. Holly, thank you so much for your phone call. We're going to jump over one more time. Edith in California. Edith, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Edith, what is your point of view?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for this program. I try to listen to it as often as I can, and it has been such a wealth of information, so thank you very much. I wanted to say that I think one of the missing words from across the board in our culture is the word responsibility. We just focus on freedom, and it's gotten us into a really big spot. But regarding this particular subject, I would like to say, well, first of all, I've been out of town and I haven't listened to what's going on with all that stuff. But at any rate, the responsibility of these, social media, they're missing that. There's the responsibility aspect in the radio and the television is that you say, well, we can't use these words, we can't use these words. So it seemed to me that it would make great sense to have some sort of parameters and boundaries of what kind of language could go across the social media. There's tremendous devastation going on in the lives of our young people because these kids are just lashing out at one another with heinous behavior and heinous words, and they're mimicking all this other stuff. So that's all I wanted to say. Love and truth.
Yes, ma'am. I think that's one of the interesting things, especially from a millennial perspective. I've said it before that we are a generation, and I think we're living in a spirit of the air right now that wants to fight for their rights, but nobody wants to ask, what is my duty? Specifically,
Absolutely.
What is my responsibility to not only myself, but also to my neighbor and then to my God as well? And I think that's a pretty key question to ask, not necessarily what can I get to the world, but what can I give to the world and make the world a better place, which is just unfortunately lacking, but hopefully we can continue to have our freedom of speech to be able to not only ask the question, but then to be able to live into the answer as well.
I totally agree. And, our sin nature, this anger, I was speaking with some Italian friends visiting from Italy the other day, and they were talking about it. They call it the generation of anger, the angry generation, and it's permeating across the world due to the social media, and we know in our fleshly selves where anger can go without the controls of the Holy Spirit. And by allowing by having no clear boundaries in social media, just feeds because most of the people on social media aren't believers, and so they don't have the work of the Holy Spirit controlling their mouths and their lives. And so sometimes we have to have the outside boundaries to make that happen. So that's all I have to say, and thank you so much for letting me talk, and praise God for your being on the air. May He continue to bless this ministry.
Thank you so much, Edith. We're exceedingly grateful for you. And Kerby, she brings up some great points that, again, if we're just looking at the internet right now, we're beginning to see where people stand. And for better or for worse, the pessimist inside of me wants to be like, whoa, the world is kind of broken right now. But also the optimist wants to say inside of me, there is some great opportunity right now. Because we have freedom of speech, we can see the status of individuals, and it can help us to have a better understanding of how we might be able to reach out, how we might be able to respond, how we might be able to extend grace in the midst of this time. And what a time to be alive.
Well, and again, what a time to be alive when you think about the fact that we are the inheritors of tremendous prosperity and freedom. This, as my commentary that's coming out, as a matter of fact, even came out today, just the fact that we are in a time when there's very little violence. These people that talk about being victims, they're some of the most privileged people to live on the planet. And again, back to what Edith has to say, we talk about rights, but we don't talk about responsibility. You talked about duty. You know, words like duty, purity, integrity, chastity, honesty, those sound like words that belong in a previous century. And it's time to revitalize some of those ideas and talk about those as Christians. So it brings us back to some of the things we talked about here today, that we need to be the model first for a watching society and begin to show people the truthfulness of the gospel by our behavior.
We need to put duty-free back where it belongs, which is in the airports, and then ask individuals, what is my duty to not only my country, but my neighbor, and then my God as well. Well, thank you all so much for listening. We are so grateful. And so, Kerby, what's happening tomorrow?
We got Dr. Jared Stevens on. We're going to talk about his new book, and then we're going to get into some of these other issues in the news that we actually only sort of touched on today, so we'll get to those tomorrow.
There might be a couple. If I had a hunch, I would say there's going to be some news tomorrow for you to be able to talk about.
And I'm thinking we'll resolve some of these elections, if nothing else. We still aren't exactly sure who is elected and who is not elected. And I also want to bring in some studies that have been done about some people that are voting more than once.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that you could do that.
Well, apparently some people are. Even dead people have been voting lately, so we'll get into that tomorrow,
Haley
too.
Joel Osment sees dead people, and apparently some people are voting dead. But nevertheless, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back tomorrow. See you then.
Imagine a police officer telling you you can't pray in your own home. That happened not too long ago to Mary Ann Souse in Kansas. And in 2017, the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the officer. But this year, thanks to an investment of $1, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that ruling. Okay, let me explain. Over the years, listeners to Point of View have made a big difference. Some have become congressmen. Others have saved lives through helping women in crisis pregnancies. Others have become constitutional attorneys, like Kelly Shackelford, who represented Mary Ann Souse. We recently discovered it costs about $1 to reach a Point of View listener on the radio and online for an entire year. You can't buy much for $1 these days, but you can transform the nation. Call today and invest in Point of View at 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net, because $1 really can go a long, long way. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.